Imagine you've lived in the same house for 30 years. You know every creak in the floorboards, every light switch, every corner. Then one day, you discover a door you've never noticed before. You open it and discover there's someone living in there. They've been there the whole time, making decisions, moving things around, living a completely separate life, and you had no idea they existed. And equally disturbing, they had no idea about you either. Two of you, same house, 30 years, both convinced you were the only one there. It sounds like a horror movie, except it's not. This is what happened when neuroscientists started studying split brain patients. They uncovered something unsettling, that there could well be two people living in your skull right now. Two separate consciousnesses, each with their own beliefs, preferences, and agendas. And if your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, who's actually in control? This isn't just some weird neuroscience trivia. It's a profound question that reaches into everything you think you know about being yourself. By the end of this, you'll contemplate whether you are just wiring and chemicals or something deeper. But first, we need to talk about split brains and what happens when the bridge between your two brain hemispheres gets severed. In the 1960s, doctors faced a brutal problem. Epilepsy patients who had seizures so severe that nothing they could offer worked. The electrical storm in their brains would jump from one hemisphere to the other, amplifying until it became life-threatening. It was agreed that surgeons would try something radical. They would cut the corpus callosum, the thick cable of nerve fibers connecting the two halves of the brain. By stopping seizures from traveling from one part of the brain to another, it was hoped that they could be reduced in severity or even eliminated altogether. Think of the corpus callosum as an Ethernet cable connecting two supercomputers. It's a bundle of 200 million nerve fibers passing about 4 billion signals per second. In a healthy brain, your left and right hemispheres are in constant conversation. Your left brain handles language and logic. Your right brain processes spatial awareness and emotion, but they collaborate so seamlessly that you experience one unified you. When that cable gets cut, the supercomputers are still running. They're just not connected or speaking to each other anymore. And that's when we see things starting to get strange. The result is two separate processing centers in one skull. Each hemisphere has its own perceptions, its own preferences, and sometimes even its own beliefs. And researchers discovered this in the most unsettling way possible. In one famous case study, researchers Michael Gazzaniga and Joseph Ledoux worked with a patient known as Paul S. After the surgery, they showed him a card with a simple question: do you believe in God? But here's the trick. They presented it only to his left visual field, which the right brain processes. Paul pointed to a card that said, no. Then they showed the same question to his right visual field, processed by the left brain. This time Paul pointed to yes. Same person, same question, two completely different answers. This wasn't a contradiction in belief. It was two separate consciousnesses giving honest responses. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The really eerie findings came when researchers began testing how the two brain hemispheres functioned without knowing what the other was doing. Other visual tests were undertaken with patients. This included the key test. Researchers had patients stare at a fixation point, then briefly flashed the word key to the left visual field. Because the flash was so quick, only the right brain saw it. Then they asked the patient, "What did you see?" The left brain, which controls speech and hadn't seen anything, confidently answered, "Nothing." Then they asked the patient to reach behind a screen with their left hand, which is controlled by the right brain, and pick up the object they saw. The left hand immediately grabbed the key because the right brain had seen it, even though the speaking left brain previously insisted it had seen nothing, because it hadn't. However, once the key had been selected, the patients often offered invented yet confident reasons for picking it up, even though the left brain, controlling speech, had not seen what the right brain had. Two separate belief systems, two separate decision makers, two people in one skull. That's what all the experiments revealed. But here's the strange thing. The split brain patients didn't feel like two separate people. They felt unified despite the loss of the connection between their brains. The reason for this has to do with a mechanism Gazzaniga discovered, which he called the left brain interpreter. Think of it like having a press secretary living in your head whose job it is to spin whatever happens into a coherent story, regardless of whether they have any idea of what's actually going on. This is what made split brain patients feel like one person, even when their hemispheres held completely different beliefs. The left brain, which controls speech, simply invented explanations for whatever the right brain did. And it did this with complete confidence. And the research uncovered, rather disturbingly, that we must all have this interpreter running 24/7, even without a split brain. We just didn't know it before. Imagine your roommate doing something bizarre, and instead of asking them why, you just announce a confident explanation to your dinner guests. That's your brain, every single day. But why does this happen, especially in healthy brains? It happens because your brain is constantly running predictive coding. It's guessing what happens next, then checking after if it was right. It does this to conserve energy. Most of what you experience as perception isn't raw sensory input. It's your brain's best guess about what's probably happening based on past experience. When the prediction fails, you notice the door that wasn't there yesterday, the word you misheard, but most of the time, you're living inside your brain's prediction, not in reality. When there are gaps in the data, the interpreter smooths them over. It fills in the blanks. It makes you feel like you understand what's happening, even when you don't. Confabulation isn't lying, it's a memory error. The split-brain patients weren't being dishonest. They genuinely believed their explanations, even though their interpreter had no access to the truth. If the interpreter can be this wrong in split-brain patients, how often is your intact brain doing the same thing? Ever remembered an event that didn't happen? Been absolutely certain you said something you never actually said? That's your interpreter, smoothing over the gaps, keeping the story coherent. Which brings us to the big question. If consciousness is just neurons firing, why does it feel so unified and continuous? Are we just meat computers running faulty code? Or is there something about you that transcends the wiring? But before we go there, we need to address the elephant in the room, because right now you might be thinking, wait, two consciousnesses? Isn't that just schizophrenia? Split brain syndrome and schizophrenia sound similar, but they're fundamentally different disorders, and the difference tells us something crucial about how consciousness works. Schizophrenia is a psychiatric condition involving altered perception of reality. People with schizophrenia might hear voices, experience delusions, or have difficulty distinguishing their own thoughts from external input. But here's the key. Their corpus callosum is intact. The two hemispheres are still talking to each other. The problem isn't separation, it's malfunction in how the brain processes and interprets information. Split brain patients, by contrast, have structurally separated hemispheres. The hardware is disconnected, not malfunctioning. Each hemisphere processes information normally within its own domain. There are no hallucinations, no delusions, just two separate processors running independently, each unaware of what the other knows. Think of it this way. Schizophrenia is like having faulty software that misinterprets the data. Split brain is like having two perfectly functional computers that can't communicate with each other anymore. In schizophrenia, the unified self is disrupted by distorted perception. In split-brain patients, there are genuinely two separate processing centers, each with coherent awareness within its own sphere. One is a breakdown of unity, the other is a doubling of it, which means we can't avoid the question anymore. If you can divide consciousness by cutting a cable, what does that say about the self? About the soul? If you believe in a soul, a single, indivisible essence that makes you, you, split-brain patients present a philosophical nightmare. Where's the soul? Did the surgery split one soul into two? That seems absurd. Souls aren't supposed to be divisible like a cell undergoing mitosis. But if there's still only one soul, which hemisphere has it? The speaking left brain, because it can articulate beliefs. The silent right brain, because it can feel and perceive. Or maybe there were always two souls sharing one body, unaware of each other until the surgery forced them into separate corners. This isn't just abstract philosophy. This is a real person with one body, two belief systems, and the question of whether their essence, their self, their soul, whatever makes them can be carved in half with a scalpel. Religious and philosophical traditions have long insisted on the unity and indivisibility of the self. The soul is one. Consciousness is singular. But split-brain patients suggest that self is less like a singular diamond and more like a coalition government. Multiple processes, constantly negotiating, usually in such seamless coordination that you experience it as one. And here's the really uncomfortable part. If the soul is supposed to be the irreducible core of you, why can it be functionally divided by a scalpel? Why does cutting a bundle of nerve fibers create two separate belief systems? Two separate decision makers? Two separate selves? One answer is materialist. There is no soul. There's just the brain. Consciousness is what the brain does. And when you divide the brain, you divide consciousness. You are the pattern, not some immaterial essence riding along inside the machine. Another answer is spiritual. The soul exists, but it's not located in any one place. It's the animating principle that transcends the physical structure, and severing the corpus callosum doesn't divide it. It just limits how it can express itself through a divided instrument. Maybe the earlier patient with competing religious beliefs in the sides of his brain was, in reality, a believer who struggled with some doubts. When the brain was connected, maybe this is how it reconciled those differences. Or maybe he was agnostic. There is no indication that his views on the matter were sought prior to the surgery. But here's what we can say. Split-brain patients still feel like one person. They don't wake up thinking, which me am I today? The sense of self persists, even when the structure that generates it has been severed. So maybe the question isn't, do you have a soul? Maybe it's, what does it mean to be one person when the system generating you is made of separable parts? That's not a question neuroscience can answer definitively, but it's one that split brain research forces us to confront. Split brain surgery wasn't done for science. It was a last resort for people whose epilepsy was killing them. These patients consented, knowing the risks. They gave up the seamless unity of their consciousness to stop the seizures that were destroying their lives. Modern imaging technology has mostly replaced the need for these surgeries, but the legacy data remains invaluable. These patients gave science an irreplaceable window into consciousness. They also lived with profound challenges. In rare cases, some patients developed what's called alien hand syndrome. One documented patient, Karen Byrne, experienced her left hand attempting to strangle her while her right hand fought it off. Remember earlier when we talked about two separate processing centers, each with its own preferences and agendas? This is what that looks like when the conflict goes physical. Two hemispheres in literal, violent disagreement about what the body should do. Imagine your hand having its own agenda, trying to harm you, while your other hand fights it off. It's darkly funny until you realize someone actually lived through that. This suggests that consciousness isn't just location. It's something that only appears when all the parts work together, like how a symphony isn't in any single instrument, but in what happens when they all play at once. From a purely physical standpoint, humans are made of neurons and chemicals, but you might be the pattern those neurons create. Not the hardware itself, but the unique configuration. Perhaps consciousness, or soul, or whatever you want to call that intangible sense of I am, isn't located in any single cell or region. Maybe it's like a whirlpool in water, not a thing you can point to, but a pattern that only exists when the water moves in that specific way. If that's true, then split brain research doesn't disprove the soul. It just shows us that whatever makes you you is more distributed, more resilient, and stranger than we thought. You're not reduced to your wiring. You're the pattern that only exists when those specific neurons fire in that specific sequence. You're what the brain does when it's being you. So let's return to the question we started with. If there are two people living in your skull, each making decisions, each with their own beliefs, who's actually in control? The answer split brain research gives us is this: you've been asking the wrong question. Control isn't a throne with one person sitting on it. It's a conversation. You're not a CEO issuing commands from headquarters. You're a coalition, multiple systems, multiple processes, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in conflict, constantly negotiating who gets to drive. What you experience as control is just the story your brain tells itself after the fact to make sense of what already happened. So is you just chemicals and wiring, or something deeper? The answer is, we don't know. The research shows us this: the interpreter that keeps your story coherent, that makes you feel like one person. It's still running even when the evidence says you're not. It smooths over the contradictions. It invents explanations. It makes you feel unified even when your hemispheres hold opposing beliefs. Which means the question isn't, are you one person or two? The question is, how much of what you call yourself is just that interpreter, working overtime, stitching together a crowd of competing voices into something that feels like a single I? Maybe there's something beyond the neurons, a soul, an essence, something irreducible. Or maybe you are just the story the interpreter tells to make sense of the committee meeting happening in your skull. Split brain research can't tell us which one is true, but it does show us that the unity you experience, that seamless sense of being one person, is more delicate than you thought. It's a construction, and when the bridge gets cut, the construction doesn't collapse. It just gets weirder. Maybe you're hardware and software, neurons and narrative, or maybe you're something that uses that pattern to express itself. When the cable is cut, either the pattern divides or the expression fragments. We can describe what happens. We just can't yet explain what it means. So the next time your hand does something without thinking, you confidently explain a decision you don't actually understand, or you feel absolutely certain about something you can't quite justify, pause. Ask yourself, who just made that call? Which part of the coalition is speaking right now? And how much of what I believe about me is just the interpreter, smoothing over the gaps, filling in the blanks, keeping the story coherent? You might not like the answer, but at least you'll know there's a question worth asking. As for the split brain patients, yes, the surgery did have a positive impact on their seizures, albeit with the challenges we've touched upon. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out these. We think you'd like them too. Hit the notification bell to be sure to see our next video. Until next time, my friends, stay curious.